My name is Kevin William Francis Caldwell. An introduction might seem a little bit silly because I know many of the people in this room personally, work with them or volunteer with them or am helped volunteering with them. So yeah, absolutely. Here is my presentation on philosophy in prison. I want to thank everyone who's made this possible. I want to thank the college and the College Scholars Program for letting me present. I'm really excited to do this. So today I'm going to tell you about the Philosophy in Prison program. This started in 2015 as a partnership between the UMKC Philosophy Department and the Arts in Prison program. So I have not been a part of it since 2015. I think I started in 2018 or maybe early 2019. So this program predates me. I did not found it. I just wanted to let everyone know all about that. So let's see. A lot of people wait for contributions at the end, but I wanted to say since I did not start the program, I wanted to actually start with all the people who make this possible. While I do currently lead the sessions, without all the other people that would not be possible. And leading the sessions mostly means picking a reading, printing it, and showing up every time, which isn't a whole lot more than the rest of the volunteers do. Absolutely. So our founder and director is Sydney Harvey. She founded the program in 2015. She is currently getting her PhD, so she is not currently attending our sessions, but oftentimes does when she comes back from school. Additionally, the program certainly would not be possible without Lee Lynch, who is in attendance tonight. Absolutely, she leads the Arts in Prison programs, and we really couldn't do it without her. She has been such a great support through all of the everything that's happened from lockdowns to the pandemic to weather cancellations. She's really made sure that everything runs smoothly. We also have a faculty mentor, Clancy Martin. He usually objects to being called Dr. Martin. Sometimes people have lovingly even used pet names like Clancy Pants with Clancy, although that's not one that I call him. He really helps make it possible. He has attended, it's been a while though. He teaches, I believe, part-time in India, so he's split between Kansas City and India, so he doesn't always make it out to Lansing anymore, but we really couldn't have the program without him. Additionally, Laura Filippi helps keep all the volunteering running at Lansing Correctional Facility. Without that and without being trained, we wouldn't be allowed in. So we definitely need her. Additionally, the administrative assistants, as always, really help make the show happen. Really couldn't do it without them. The largest cost to our program is printing. And without Cynthia and now Jana, we really would not have a program running at all. So a lot like here at the college, without the administrative assistants, there really nothing would run. So even though they don't actually attend our sessions, I really wanted to put their names up there. And since the program has been running since 2015, I don't know everyone who's ever been a part of it, but I can throw out some names right now. I know Seth has been a part of it ever since we got started going after the pandemic. We also recently had a volunteer retire from doing volunteering with us, David. He couldn't make it here tonight, though he really wanted to. Additionally, Hope, who also couldn't make it, she is currently volunteering. When I started, I think Jonathan and Helen were leading it. And of course, as I had on there earlier, Clancy and Sydney have been a part of it for a really long time. Who else? I know a few other volunteers' names, so I just wanted to throw as many out there as I could remember, but I'm sure I'm going to leave someone out. We've had Hamza, Sasha, Kylie, Damien, Courtney, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Many of them had started doing it before I did, so I feel really lucky to be leading the program right now. But anybody who I did not mention, all of our participants, we are really indebted to everyone who is a part of the program, absolutely. So let's see. Like I was saying, our program started in 2015 as a partnership between the Arts in Prison program and the UMKC Philosophy Department. I think it's a really incredible partnership between a community organization and a university department that you don't really see that often. And as far as I'm concerned, it seems to have run really seamlessly. For the most part. On the volunteering side of things, Lee helps us so much. As far as getting things printed, the philosophy department does so much for us. And I think it's a really good model for cooperation between any community organization and any educational organization, whether it be a community college, a university, other schools. So before I was a part of it, it won an award. I don't know a ton about the award because that was long before I started volunteering, but I do think it's really incredible that the program was only running for about a year before it won a prize from the American Philosophical Association. That's a really big deal in philosophy. I'm not sure how many people in here were ever in a philosophy department, but that organization is a huge deal, absolutely. We have done all sort of, all the different wings, really. We've done everything from minimum before I started. Whenever I started, they had moved it to minimum and maximum combined, and that is where we were for a long time. Then the pandemic happened and we had to stop for a little bit, and when we came back to minimum. We had ebbs and flows of participation in minimum. Eventually we decided to go back to the medium maximum because a lot of times in the minimum wing, we have people who might not be in for that much longer and who might not really want to get involved in a new thing. They might already have too many things on their plate. Everything from finding a job for when they're out to remaking those connections. So we switched back to medium and maximum security, and that is currently where we are running. And so we run bi-weekly. It's every other Thursday. So this is actually during the time when we would normally be just wrapping up a session. But last Thursday we did, and next Thursday we will again. We've occasionally talked about trying to make it every single week. We haven't done that yet, mostly due to gas prices. Getting out to Lansing, I think from UMKC, it is a 32-mile drive one way, so 64 miles both ways, and doing that every single week is a little bit tough, although I think all of us enjoyed it enough that we'd be willing to put that much money into it. Like you see here, it ran from 2015 to 2020 bi-weekly. The only cancellations were due to lockdowns at LCF. Things like weather is pretty frequent. Since we're associated with UMKC, if UMKC cancels classes for any reason, we tend to not host class. Although there are some times like spring break or other things like that where we will still host class just because the more you go, the more likely the program is to keep going. The more times we miss with an every other week program, if we miss 2 weeks, that really means that we missed a whole month. And so we really try to get that out there as often as possible. Who can be a volunteer? I'm not going to run down this whole list. A few really important things. You have to be 21. None of these rules are mine, but I do have to abide by them and when necessary enforce them. And so you have to be 21. That has been a difficulty sometime because the average college age is commonly a little bit less than 21. And so we've had a lot of people who really want to get involved, and we get to this part of the presentation and they say, oh gosh, I'm 18 or 19. And we say, well, we can't have you come in until you are 21. So sometimes people have stuck with us and get back involved. A lot of times people have either moved on or might not even be going to school where they heard about us. So yeah, you have to be 21, the age of 21 years or older. Other than that, some pretty straightforward things. So you are not allowed to have a close family member incarcerated within the Kansas Department of Corrections anywhere in Kansas. So that one, I think we can see why that might be the case, why if you had a really close family member, we wouldn't want that. Other than that, we cannot be on the visiting list. I don't see it up here. I took this directly from the rules of LCF. But you also cannot be on the mailing list of any incarcerated individual in the state of Kansas and be a volunteer. They don't really like that kind of thing. Other than that, you actually can be an ex-offender. That is decided on a case-by-case basis. I don't think we've had any ex-offenders volunteer with us, but that is not prohibited. Yeah. Other than that, you really don't have to have any special education. I have a dual bachelor's degree, and most of our volunteers are working on their bachelor's, but volunteering in general doesn't really take any special education. So let's see. Dress code. So I do want to say again, this is not my set of rules. Unfortunately, when necessary, I do have to let people know, but if I don't let them know, the person at the front desk will turn them away. So while I will say some of these rules might seem really straightforward, other ones I see some people looking like, oh my gosh, why is that a rule? So top of the list, blue jeans. I know a lot of people are probably wondering right now why no blue jeans. Anyone who has been in Lansing Correctional Facility understands that the people incarcerated in Lansing wear blue jeans. And so because of that, we cannot be getting mixed up with the people who are incarcerated. And so we're not allowed blue jeans. Any other color of jeans is allowed or are allowed. Let's see. Most of these do say for men or women. I think it's pretty obvious which group that most of these rules are actually geared toward. Again, those aren't my rules, but these rules were mostly put in place to keep people safe while volunteering. We have had a few times when we get to the front desk and the person at the front desk doesn't like what someone is wearing. In that case, we have usually one of two options. Send them home or have them run to the Dollar General down the street really quick and buy some scrubs. It's really not that far. And I've actually had one of our participants who is incarcerated in Lansing. He sometimes jokes that he thinks that the staff at Lansing have some sort of under-the-table deal with Dollar General, being that even sometimes his lawyer will come to the facility and they'll say, I don't like what you're wearing, and she will have to run very quickly to Dollar General, buy some scrubs, change, and come back, which is unfortunate. That does waste a little bit of time. But usually it's not a huge issue. We usually try to dress pretty nicely. While it's not part of the dress code, and this is only the first page of the dress code, there's more. I won't run down the line, but we usually try to wear either button-up shirts, slacks, things of that nature, just to dress nicely for the guys. I will say that I think the incarcerated men who are a part of our program, they dress in the nicest things they can when they come to our program, and I really frequently see them getting haircuts the minute before our session starts. We walk by the, I'm not sure if they would call it a salon, yeah, the barbershop. We walk right by the barbershop, and they are in there up to the minute getting their hair cut to look the best for our sessions. So we're going to go on to the next part of the dress code. Again, I won't run down the line. I think a lot of this is probably straightforward. Anything that would not usually be considered school appropriate is not allowed. So the first one was no blue jeans, and then at the very end of the line, you might be wondering why no light blue, gray, or white t-shirts. That's a pretty common thing for the guys in Lansing to wear as well. So as much difference as possible. Additionally, it does say, I believe it was on the last slide, no hats. We don't wear hats, but it is very common for the guys in Lansing. They have red beanies and red baseball caps. So that is the most common thing that you will see. Yeah, let's see, anything else? I think that's about it. So our participant backgrounds. So we've had a ton of different participants from everything from our students at UMKC to professors at UMKC to the guys incarcerated in Lansing. When I started the program, we had a huge group. We had, I never really counted, but I would guess probably 19 to 20 guys would show up from inside Lansing, as well as probably 5 to 7 volunteers every time. So we had a very full room. Then the pandemic happened, and after the pandemic, for quite a while, we were not allowed back in. And so the program was kind of on hiatus. We were all still very interested in getting back in there. We just were not allowed in. Many of the correctional facilities in Kansas, as well as really the rest of the United States and probably the world, weren't allowing visits at all. Even whenever I started working as a GED instructor at another correctional facility, they still weren't allowing in-person visits, and that was within the last year. And that included family. So in some of these facilities, family members were not allowed in, although they were allowed some Zoom connection. We have had a huge diversity of race, religion, as well as whatever philosophies people come from. I will say that people have talked a lot about religion. I'd say that a lot of our guys, the main place that they get their philosophy is usually either from the Gospels, the Quran, or from one of the Buddhist philosophers, or in 1 or 2 cases, even some, we have had a few people involved who were self-described Satanists. And I'll be honest with you, I don't think outside of our sessions, I'm not sure that I've ever seen a Muslim, a Christian, a Buddhist, and a Satanist, as well as probably some atheists in the room, sit down and have a really well-mannered conversation about the meaning of life. Maybe that might happen on some college campuses, but outside of a college classroom and our volunteering program, I'm really not sure where that kind of discussion takes place. I will be honest, I think outside of our sessions, a lot of the guys who talk to each other in our sessions, I'm not so certain that they talk to each other outside of our sessions. Sometimes that could be due to the wings where they might be living, or it might be due to some personal disagreements or otherwise that are kept outside of our sessions. Ranges of sentencing, so we never ask. We have no idea what any of the guys in Lansing have done, and we don't ask how long they're going to be in there. Occasionally they mention one or two things, but we really quickly curb that conversation and get back to course material. But I will say that some people have fairly short sentences, especially in minimum security. We heard some people say they would likely be getting out within 6 months or some within 2 years. Within maximum, the medium maximum combined, we have had a couple of times where people mentioned that unless something changed, they weren't getting out. So that was about as far as that conversation went. But that is the variety. While we do have their names and their numbers as a part of attendance, we refuse to, and as part of the guidelines at the facility, we refuse to look up any of their behaviors in the past. Really, that comes down to two reasons. One, if you did look it up, you might see something you really didn't want to see, and then you would not feel comfortable coming back into the facility. Or you would see something and think, oh gosh, I feel kind of bad for that person, which would not be conducive to volunteering. So we just don't look it up, and it doesn't really ever come up in our sessions. Everybody is very respectable, very polite. People really take turns when talking. It's really nice. People raise their hands. People wait to be called on to speak, and everybody has a really engaging conversation. Absolutely. So engagement. Unlike a college classroom where you are required to attend and you get credits and you have to pay and you get graded on participation, really none of that is a part of our sessions at Lansing. Self-directed engagement, we usually when we start a session, we have brought a reading in during our last session, and we take about 2 weeks to read that. And after the 2 weeks, we come back and we discuss it, and usually after a few, how have you been, things like that, we jump into what did you think of the reading? And we usually don't have a second to waste from that moment until the very end of our sessions. Things really, as our other volunteers could probably tell you, the discussion never stops. If it does stop for even a moment, it's usually because we're taking a minute to think and collect ourselves and re-engage. So unlike a normal college classroom where sometimes it can maybe feel a little bit like pulling teeth to get people to engage, really, even if the volunteers didn't say a single word, there would be constant engagement through the entire hour and a half every other week at Lansing. Participation is optional though. We do have some guys who just don't really talk much, and it's not because they can't, it's just because they don't feel like it. Some of those guys have written things or written them and then read them to us later, but for the most part, every single session, we have nearly everybody say something on topic and engaging, which again, anybody who's taught in a college classroom might worry about how on topic things stay. Usually it stays very close to our source material. And lastly, and probably most importantly, it's free. You don't have to pay for a college class. The volunteers and the guys in Lansing don't have to pay. It is not a credit-bearing class, and so I think that's really good. So guys who have no high school diploma, guys who already have high school diplomas or already have a lot of college experience, they can all participate for free. The only costs of the program are mostly for the volunteers, and that is the gas money to get out to Lansing Correctional Facility, which, like I said, can be a little bit steep depending on the time of year, what gas prices are, but we're all willing to sort of take that as it comes. And then the printing that UMKC does, which is really substantial. I usually print out at least 10 to 15 readings every time, usually at least 10 pages. So we're talking about hundreds of pages every other week. And so that's not something that my personal budget on my home printer could probably take. And so UMKC is really wonderful to keep printing for us. So let's see. Yeah, I will say, since before the pandemic, we had a really large group, and we have started to see people from that really large group returning. Some people can't return sometimes because of the times they work. Some people might be surprised, but the guys in Lansing do have jobs inside Lansing. One of our guys actually does plumbing. He was telling us the other week that, sorry, I'm late. I had to strip wires for the plumbing in here, and that took a while. And so sometimes because of work or whatever else, they can't make our sessions, but we have started to see people who were part of our program from before the pandemic. We've started to see them really come back in. I was really, really excited last Thursday because I think 2 of the last 4 of our sessions were canceled. One of those sessions was canceled due to lockdown at the facility, so no one's coming in. And the other one was due to weather. We didn't really get prior notice about the weather. Lee was wonderful and really checked in, and still we just didn't get the notice, but the volunteer coordinator of Lansing was out that week. So things happen, but we all came, and so we weren't allowed in. We got all the way to the classroom hallway that most of the correctional facilities in Kansas have, and we got to the hallway and we were like, oh gosh, the lights are out and the door is locked. The people at the first 2 security checks had not let us know, but that is all right. Despite all of that, last Thursday we actually had our largest attendance since the pandemic, which I thought was really amazing. I think we had 9 or 10 guys. I think only 8 signed our attendance sheet, despite me running around the room. Did everyone sign it? Did everyone sign it? Still, we had a few people escape without signing it. But yeah, absolutely. I think free is a really great thing for the program. None of the guys have to worry about how to come up with money for credit hours. And if they would want to take a credit-bearing philosophy class, Donnelly College has a philosophy class that is required as part of their college curriculum. So we're not actually the only philosophy program at Lansing. So here are just a few of the topics we've covered. Since it's a program that has run since 2015, you can imagine that if we talked about all the topics, this presentation would be very long and this slide would probably have multiple continuations. But these are just a few of the things we've talked about. We've done everything from ancient philosophy, ranging from texts that were written almost 4,000 years ago, to texts from really, really recently that were written within my lifetime. And so we've really spanned the range from really ancient philosophy to modern philosophy and everything in between, really. Usually we choose our topics, we'll pick a topic and try and stay on it for a while, but if we start to hear people mention things that they really like, we'll try and bring that up. So when we were having conversations about, let's say, the meaning of life and existentialism, people started to bring up things like love and responsibility. So although it is not up here, we did have a short section on the philosophy of love and care, which went really, really well. And then out of that, we started talking about responsibility. So we're just about to jump back into maybe some philosophy associated with responsibility. I think our reading for next week is from Jean-Paul Sartre. So talks a lot about responsibility and freedom. So yeah, those are just a few of the things we've talked about. We've talked about much more than just that, but let's jump into some specifics. So this was actually from before the pandemic. We had a section on the philosophy of time, which was really interesting. We read a piece by Tarkovsky, which I'm not sure if anybody here is familiar with Tarkovsky, but he was a Russian film director who also wrote a lot. He described filmmaking as sculpting in time. And so this sort of bridged the gap between a philosophy of time and a philosophy of aesthetics. So if people didn't read the reading or weren't really familiar with his movies, we could still just talk about art, movies, time in general. And I know what people might be thinking over here with the themes. What the heck does it mean drawing time? That was actually an activity that one of our volunteers came up with. I think it was Sydney. She came in, and to start off our discussion, she passed out little sheets of paper and crayons and said, everybody draw what you think time is. There are only 2 rules. No clocks, no numbers. And so we spent probably the better part of 10 or 15 minutes trying to draw what we thought time was. Some people drew a tree going from a seed all the way up to a large tree. Some people drew spirals. I think mine looked something like a music, the sheet music bar, and then a lot of scribbles on top of it. So that was really fun and engaging and not something I had thought of before. I think anybody who ever talks about time or anybody who just wants a fun activity, just draw what you think time is like with no clocks and no numbers. It's not as easy as you might think. And so I like that activity because even if people did not read the reading, or it had been maybe they read it the night that we passed it out and it had been 2 weeks since they read it, it was a way to re-engage with the material. So additionally, we talked about things like the flow of time and how that might be different in different areas of life. And I think this especially pertained to the guys inside Lansing. For some of them, time feels like it doesn't really matter anymore. Actually, during this discussion, we had, although this wasn't the intention to bring this sort of thing up, we did have one guy tell us, you might notice some of us don't wear watches, and that's on purpose. We don't need them anymore, which was a really almost heartbreaking thing to hear, while in other parts of the facility in the minimum wing, that's really not the case. Those guys are usually counting months or sometimes even days to a release date. That is a really big deal for them. And so the ideas of time have really been different between the different parts of the facility that we have engaged with. And that really goes into the meaning or meaninglessness of time. For some people, time really for them is everything. Being on time, having a release date, being on time to class, having activities to do, versus those things like time and date and month really not mattering anymore. I actually had a student as part of my GED class tell me recently he went a whole calendar without really caring what month it was. And his sentence really wasn't that long, but he just said he didn't look at his calendar. It didn't matter that much to him anymore. Luckily now he doesn't have that many more months to go. Absolutely. So let's see. We also read Bergson. A lot of the same topics came up, but it was a little bit more of a difficult reading. So we kind of sometimes, if people are having trouble engaging in the reading, we like to step back for a moment from the reading and just ask, what do you think about time in general? I'm sure everybody has felt like sometimes time is moving really slowly, and other times time feels like it's moving so fast. And so that was a discussion that, regardless of whether or not people had completed the reading, we could get engagement from. And so here's our ancient philosophy. It's been a while since we've done this, but I will say doing this ancient philosophy readings actually forced me to read the oldest thing I've ever read. How many people have read the Maxims of Ptahhotep? Looks like no one. I thought maybe one or two might have as part of a college class. That is one of the oldest pieces of philosophy. Sometimes it's a little bit controversial inside of philosophy because it isn't so abstract, as this was actually written by the advisor to a pharaoh. And so it was somebody working in basically politics or government. And the Maxims of Ptahhotep, I bring that up because it is roughly 4,000 years old, about 2000 BC, I believe, although I am not a historian of texts. It was really interesting to read that because I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy. I thought I knew a ton, and as part of this program, I actually read the oldest thing I had ever read. It was really interesting to read. It consists of basically advice from Ptahhotep to his son. His son was supposed to take over his post in government, but the son was very young, and as you might imagine, the much older father wasn't sure if the boy was ready for the job yet, and so he tried to write down all the wisdom he could. One quote from the reading that has really always stuck with me, the quote up here, "Beware the heated man," which seems really abstract, really almost bizarre when you first read it, until we start talking about how we still use the term heated to describe people when they get angry or fierce with each other. And that was something we talked about a lot. When you feel that heat coming on, when you feel that anger coming on, that is something to be wary of. And it's really amazing to see that advice from so long ago still really engage people today. We went from that to something maybe even more abstract in metaphysics. What is the fundamental substance of reality? Oh my gosh, that's a pretty deep question. But from the ancient pre-Socratic philosophers, we have two really interesting answers. Thales, who is widely regarded as the first philosopher, at least in the Western world, his answer was water. Everything fundamentally is made of water. Which, interestingly, one of our guys in Lansing loved that. He was always talking about how much he thought things were like water, that he used water as a metaphor for life in a lot of ways. Going with the flow, being able to fill any shape. He was really interested in water, so when we passed out this reading, I said, hey, you're gonna love this, and he did. And really, Thales, for as long ago as he was writing, wasn't that far off. I have a lot of water, and I hope a lot of the rest of us have water in our systems right now, although he might have been a little bit off with that being the fundamental substance of reality. I think we have a few other things going on, but it's pretty important. Next, Heraclitus talked about what he thought the fundamental substance of reality was, and his answer was more like fire. He thought things worked like fire, which seems a little bit strange, but you might know his often quoted piece, the same man cannot step in the same river twice, for he is not the same man and it is not the same river. Even though he's talking about water there, that idea is really close to his idea of fire in that if we take a snapshot of fire, that's not really what fire looks like. Fire is constantly moving, flickering, ebbing and flowing, sometimes getting huge, sometimes smoldering. And so that was something that he thought, essentially with fire, he was thinking that the only constant is change, which is something that you can see between water and fire. So even though they have what we might think of as opposite answers, it's something that really in our discussions we were able to talk about the similarities of. And I know some people might be thinking, now we're just talking about philosophy. Yeah, we're going to talk about just philosophy for a little bit. Additionally, we talked about Zeno's paradoxes. So a few of Zeno's paradoxes include things like the paradox of motion, like how is it possible that one object can reach another object, especially if we think mathematically with the math that Zeno would have been familiar with. This is pre-calculus. Calculus solved his problem. He just didn't know about it yet, didn't come around for a while. That if we take the distance, say, between me and this wall, and we cut it in half, and we cut it in half again, we cut it in half again, if we put that on a calculator and we kept hitting equals, it's never going to reach zero, which I would like to think when I touch the wall, I'm actually touching the wall, that we have reached a zero distance between us. And so Zeno was really upset. Why does our math not seem to work with reality? Which a long time after him, between a few different people working in a few different places, calculus really solved that issue, which was actually calculus was come up with by two different philosophers, not corresponding with each other at about the same time. Newton and Leibniz both discovered calculus, in a large part trying to respond to Zeno's problems, like, it's got to be possible that we close the distance between us and another object, so how can we do that? So, given that, let's move on to our history of philosophy. We did read Plato's Credo, which, as some of you might be familiar with, in this dialogue, Socrates is in prison. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to read it, is to show that one of the biggest names in Western philosophy, maybe one of the biggest names ever, he was imprisoned at one point. And it is a dialogue about why he chose to stay in prison rather than trying to break out. And I thought that was a long time ago that we read that, and I thought that was a really interesting read. Additionally, we talked about ethics. And so we really tried to focus on things like character and virtue ethics. And so with that, we talked about, why be ethical? It seems like a lot of times trying to do the right thing might put you behind in some way or the other. But we tried to really flip that on its head and say, really, if you are virtuous and ethical in the way that Aristotle is talking about, then you will sort of reach a fulfillment of who you are, or a flourishing. Aristotle used the Greek term eudaimonia. Here's your Greek lesson for the day. Some people have roughly translated it as happiness. I don't think that's very good, although I don't speak a lot of Greek. I think flourishing is a much better translation of eudaimonia, and really thinking that if you are virtuous, if you cultivate these virtues, that you really come into yourself, that you really self-develop into a better person, and that helps you out. And so instead of thinking of ethics as a series of actions that may put you ahead or behind, trying to think of it as a series of virtues that you cultivate, that was a really amazing part of our session. Sometimes our guys in Lansing, they like to throw questions at us. And so I remember one time a guy asked me what my favorite book was, and I was, that's a hard pick, but I was talking about it. And then he pointed at Seth and said, "What's the meaning of life?" And it was like, oh my gosh, I got the easy question. I thought my question was hard. And so we kind of had to sit there and talk about that for a minute. When we were talking about virtues, one of the guys said something like, "Kevin, what's your virtue?" Oh my gosh, you're putting me on the spot here, but okay. I started talking about working in education and how things like patience were really, really important, especially working on the same material week after week. And so cultivating things like patience might help you become a better teacher and a better person eventually. Other characteristics that we talked about included things like honesty, bravery, kindness, and how for Aristotle, each of those you can go a little too far in one direction or the other. So I think we might know people who aren't honest enough, but we might also know people who, as far as honesty goes, might get to the point that we might call brutally honest, which is probably better than lying, but at the same time, it doesn't really get you where you want to be. And so we talked about with each virtue that trying to go overboard with it really wouldn't work out. And so that was where Aristotle thought things should be sort of an in-between, the middle road or the golden rule, which is why Aristotle has a nice ruler there. So that was a really engaging discussion because we really went around the room, and we have actually discussed that reading a few times. That's one of the ones I pull out anytime we have a lot of new attendance. I think that's a really nice one to go back to. With that, we really have gone around the room and asked, what's a virtue that you are trying to cultivate? Anything from patience to bravery to honesty, etc. And so I think that's a really deeply engaging text, even though when you look at the name, oh my gosh, what the heck is Nicomachean? Aristotle's father and his son, their names were Nicomachus, which is a really complex version of Nick, the name Nick. And so Nick's Ethics is probably a nicer modern name for it. We also have the philosophy of love, and I know what everyone is thinking. Actually, hold on. I actually want people to raise their hands. How many people have read Bell Hooks? Okay, homework assignment for everyone who isn't raising their hands. Go home and read Bell Hooks. Doesn't have to be a ton. It could be anything from one poem to one of her books. I think she's really amazing. And now for everybody who hasn't read her, I know what you're thinking. Why no capital letters? She actually really commonly with her pen name refused to capitalize it. So that is on purpose there, not a typo. And Bell Hooks talked a lot about love. And so I actually want to read a little section from her book that we've read. Let's see here. So let's see. This is how we started our discussion on Bell Hooks was sometimes if discussion, we don't jump right into the discussion, we find a paragraph or two from the text, one of us reads it out loud and then discussion after that really does not stop. So this is part of what we read. This is part of the first chapter of her book, All About Love, called Give Love Words. To begin by always thinking of love as an action rather than a feeling is one way in which anyone using the word in this manner automatically assumes accountability and responsibility. I think accountability and responsibility in love are huge, or in really any part of life are huge. So I thought that was a really great way to engage, but I'll continue. We are often taught that we have no control over our feelings, yet most of us accept that we choose our actions and that intention and will inform what we do. We also accept that our actions have consequences. To think of action shaping feelings is one way we rid ourselves of conventionally accepted assumptions, such as that parents love their children. Unfortunately, maybe not always true, although my parents, I know they love me and always have. That unfortunately in our discussion it came up that some of our other people in the group that was not the case. And so we didn't go too deeply into personal things, but I think her saying that was really important. But I will go on here. Or that simply one falls in love without exercising will or choice. That there are things such as crimes of passion. For example, he killed her because he loved her so much. If we were constantly remembering that love is as love does, we would not use the word in a manner that devalues and degrades its meaning. When we are loving, we openly and honestly express care, affection, responsibility, respect, commitment, and trust. So those 6 things really guided our discussion. I know coming into it, if I would have had to have defined love, I think responsibility and care would have definitely been words that came to mind. But I thought all those other concepts that Bell Hooks threw at us were all things that we really deeply engaged with. And then I'll finish this quote from Bell Hooks just with a little bit more. Definitions are a vital starting point for the imagination. What we cannot imagine cannot come into being. A good definition marks our starting point and lets us know where we want to end up. As we move toward our desired destination, we chart the journey, creating a map. We need a map to guide us on our journey to love, starting with a place where we know what we mean when we speak of love. And so I think really anyone who's ever taken a philosophy class, usually the beginning of any discussion is, what do you mean when you say that? And so in this case, love, what do you mean? Starting with, what is your definition of love? And we kind of went around the room and talked about it. And we talked especially about where love comes from. So we had one of our participants really deeply engaged with this reading. And he said for a long time he didn't feel love at all. He didn't feel like he was getting it at all until he realized that he wanted love from one or two specific people. And they weren't giving it to him, but everybody else in his life was giving him love. But that he was sort of blind to it, because while he was getting love from his friends, or as he called it, homey love, while he was getting lots of that, he was sort of ignoring it and saying, there's this love of mom or dad that I think I deserve but might not be getting, or there's this love of this boy or this girl that I don't think that I'm getting love back from. And because of that, he was sort of turning a blind eye to all the love that he was feeling in life. Now with that, in general, we do try to curb personal conversations to a certain extent, but with how much that engaged with the reading and how he was sort of talking about his self-development and realizing how much love he had, I thought that was something that we sort of just let go there. With that, we also talked about types of love. I don't think in a philosophy class we would usually write the term homey love, but we might use the term philia, which is familial love. Something like that, something like brotherly love, which is also why the city of Philadelphia, Philly, familial love, absolutely. And so with that, we talked about all sort of types of love, from your family to love of your craft. In fact, as some of you might know, I know some people here know this, the word philosophy actually comes from philosophia, which means the love of wisdom. And because of that, love in philosophy is really, really important. If you don't love wisdom, you really can't be a philosopher. And so we talked about everything from love of your craft to love of wisdom to love from friendships, or how to more deeply engage in care and love through our lives. And as you can imagine, a correctional facility might not be the most fertile ground to cultivate love from, but during our discussion it was really nice to talk about that sort of thing and give people a chance to talk about that kind of stuff, something they probably don't get a chance to talk about a lot in Lansing. And then we talked also about love languages. Actually, while we were talking, I try not to hog the whiteboard and the expo marker. I know in a classroom where generally the teacher has the whiteboard and the expo marker and no one else touches it unless they say so. That's really not how I try to have things function in Lansing. And so actually while we were talking, one of the guys in our sessions, he walked up to the whiteboard and started writing all of the love languages on the whiteboard. And that really helped engage our discussion, because that wasn't really a part of our reading, but helped guide us through the rest of the conversation. Then we talked about Soren Kierkegaard's works of love, and especially with that, we talked about the difference between particular love, of maybe trying love of just one single thing or one single individual, versus a more universal concept of love, which for Soren Kierkegaard, he was although I'm not sure he would love this term, he's usually considered a Christian philosopher. He would probably say that he was a Christian and a philosopher, and he doesn't want to hyphen between them. But other than that, we really talked about the difference between love for one or the love of all. And also Kierkegaard brings up the difference between anguish and despair, which, oh my gosh, those seem like really depressing words. For Kierkegaard, despair is a little bit more like giving up hope in something, thinking it's not possible. Not because it's already presented itself as not possible, but because you have given up on putting anything into it. Versus anguish, one of our guys in the session, he said, I think anguish, the way we're talking about, is a little bit more like if we're trying to climb a mountain and it's really, really hard and we're just really hanging on, but we're not stopping. That is hope that you can still reach the top without, oftentimes when we say hope, people think, oh, that's optimism. But for Kierkegaard and for us in our session, we talked about how hope is really something that comes up whenever you most need it, where things aren't very optimistic, and where you might really be hanging on to that ledge, trying to climb to where you want to be. And so our conversation between anguish and despair really turned into a conversation about hope, which I thought was a much better thing to talk about than despair, absolutely. So we also have had a lot of really engaging conversations on Eastern philosophy, which is awesome. I actually think we've read more Eastern philosophy in Lansing now than I did in my work during my associate's degree and combined with my work during my undergrad. That I might have read one or two of these things then, but we've read all of these. And the discussions were always really engaging. I'll be honest, Confucius is not my favorite, so we don't very often bring him in. That was not my week to choose. But I really appreciate Taoism, and so we talked about Lao Tzu and Xunzi. And I also wanted to talk about a little passage from Lao Tzu that is one of the most famous passages in really all of literature, I think. This is the beginning of the Tao Te Ching, section 1. The way that can be named is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. The nameless was the beginning of heaven and earth. The name was the mother of the myriad creatures. Hence, always rid yourself of desire in order to observe its secrets. But always allow yourself to have desires in order to observe its manifestations. These two are the same, but diverge in name as they issue forth. Being the same, they are called mysteries. Mystery upon mystery, the gateway of the manifold secrets. And so that seems really obscure. I'm sure a lot of people in here are going, oh gosh, I might not have taken philosophy. What the heck does all of that mean? Don't feel bad. That's sort of where we were in Lansing, trying to parse meaning out of such a difficult text. I will say some Taoist sages have actually said about the fact that this is a really readily available paperback here for $2.95. Some Taoist sages have been asked how they felt about that, and they have said things like, oh God, I hope nobody reads that. Well, why not? Because some of the Taoist sages thought they were barely ready to start reading it, that through decades of engaging with that sort of material, that they weren't ready to say exactly what that meant yet. And so we were a little bit braver than that in Lansing, and we just threw it out, and we really had an engaging conversation. From that passage, we talked about how language doesn't always convey its meaning, that sometimes it's really easy to be misunderstood, for one thing. Even if we're speaking clearly and everybody's listening, we can still have misunderstandings. Additionally, we talked a lot about conceptual opposites. Things like how we can't really have the idea of evil without the idea of good, or without the idea of good, we can't have the idea of evil, or light and darkness, and things of that nature, and which is actually where the symbol comes from. That is a very, most people here probably know the yin and yang symbol. That is a very common symbol within Taoism, the mixing of opposite things and how they're necessary for each other to function. After that, we read the Xunzi, which in the West most people don't know about, but that is probably the more famous Taoist text for the Eastern world. It is a series of parables, one more confusing than the last usually. But as far as we went, we talked a lot about what sometimes are called the knack Tao passages, or to simplify that, skill wisdom. Knack is in something I have a knack at. And so Xunzi likes to write these really interesting passages where a king, which is usually the person in this kind of literature you would think the wisdom would be coming from, is talking to his cook, someone who he probably doesn't talk to that often. And the cook is referred to as Butcher Ding. And Butcher Ding is really amazingly carving up an oxen. And the king says, oh my God, how do you do something like that? I rule a kingdom and I have no idea how to carve up an ox. And he says, you know, it's not so much carving the ox, it's finding the space in between the meat and the bone. And if you can glide through that space, you won't ever dull your knife. And so that is a really complex way of saying, or maybe a simple way of saying, the path of least resistance is maybe better to take in a lot of ways. Where if you try to take a meat cleaver into an ox, you're not really going to get a very good cut of meat and you're going to ruin your knife. And the king is probably not going to like you very much. But that he had honed his craft to the point where he was looking for the spaces in between things. We also have some really bizarre passages from the Xunzi where other skills or knacks people have seem almost totally useless, like the old man catching cicadas on a stick, who Confucius, who is used as a character here, comes upon and asks, oh my God, how do you do that? I can't do that. Now, if I saw somebody catching cicadas on a stick, I would probably just keep walking. I'm not sure that that's a skill I need to learn how to do. But if they're really good at it, I might be a little bit impressed. Like, I know I actually can't do that one. And Confucius asked, oh my gosh, how do you do that? What sort of skill or effort do you have to put into it? And he said, really, the more I try, the less cicadas I catch. The more I try, the more they fly away. But I look at where they land. They land on the tree. And so I look over at the tree and I think, I got to hold myself like the tree. And if I can hold myself like a tree, they'll land on me. They'll do the work and I won't. And so we talked, even though I really don't want cicadas landing on me, to be honest, that sort of idea about how understanding the right effort. It's not always about the amount of effort you put in, and it's something we talked a lot about in Lansing. It's not about all the effort, it's about finding the right ways and the right place to put the effort into. Absolutely. Additionally, we read Thich Nhat Hanh, and that was a reading that one of our other volunteers picked out, a reading on Buddhism, and especially on how to cultivate things like happiness, especially in the face of, with Buddhism, one of the first things you might learn about Buddhism is that the very first truth for Buddhists isn't a very fun one. Their first fact is that suffering exists, which is not a very cheery place to start a philosophy. Luckily, by the end of it, they will say things like, there's a way out of suffering. And for that, that was something we talked a lot about with Thich Nhat Hanh. And then, like I said earlier, we have people ranging from Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Satanism in our sessions. And while a lot of the people in our reading group, they might love Jesus, or they might love Muhammad, or they might love the Buddha, I will tell you somebody that everybody loves is Bruce Lee. During any discussion on Eastern philosophy, we talk about Bruce Lee. It comes up. And as soon as you say the name Bruce Lee, the whole room, everybody is quoting, be like water, be like water, be like water. And so we talked about that quite in depth. And I always like to share this story from Bruce Lee's movie, Enter the Dragon, which is a pretty violent movie, a lot of fighting going on, but we don't talk about that part of it so much in Lansing. We talk about a scene where they're on a boat on the way to a fighting tournament, and they're all the fighters. They're not supposed to fight till they get to the island. Well, one guy is really trying to egg Bruce Lee on and say, no, let's fight now, let's get it over with. We can just figure out who's the best before we get to the island. And Bruce Lee is like, no, I don't really want to. It's not the right time, it's not the right place, but the guy won't give up. And so Bruce Lee says, okay, let's take that dinghy, let's go over to that island and let's fight and let's come back to the boat. We don't want to upset everyone else. The guy says, great, and he steps in the dinghy and Bruce Lee cuts it loose to open sea. And from the sea, the guy goes, I thought we were going to fight. I thought we were going to fight. And Bruce Lee said, I just showed you the art of fighting without fighting. And that was something we talked a lot about in our discussions, things like how every fight you don't get into is a fight you win. And that was something that really resoundingly people engaged with. That last piece wasn't a quote from me from our session, that was from one of our other participants. And so it's kind of interesting, even if people hadn't read any of this before, they had sort of gleaned it from movies they had seen before, which is a pretty common thing. While many of our participants do read our readings and engage with them directly, sometimes people go, oh, that reminds me of a movie I watched, or that reminds me of a song, which is totally fine. We can talk about movies and songs as much as they want, as much as it pertains to our material. So then we talked about aesthetics, which is a really complex way of saying the philosophy of beauty, and especially the philosophy of art. This was one of our first sessions switching from minimum back to medium maximum. And so we were not surprised that we didn't have a ton of people come, and that we also didn't have a ton of direct engagement with the text, which is all right. We sort of, anytime that happens, we like to back away from the text. It's not like a college class where the teacher might be like, well, don't come to class if you didn't read. That's really not our philosophy. If they didn't read, that's okay, come to class and we'll still talk about it. And so we talked about maybe the purpose of art. We talked a lot about what makes good art, whether it be music or visual arts. We had some people just say flat out they didn't like painting. Other people say that they were really engaged in certain lyricists versus others. We actually had, during this discussion, one of our participants went on relatively long exposition of why he thought Lil Wayne was not a good lyricist, which is is part of the material. What is the purpose of art? What's the meaning of art? What makes art good? I'll be honest, I wasn't quite sure what he was talking about with Lil Wayne. I don't know that much of his material. But then after that, he pivoted to talking about how actually, if we wanted good lyrics, we should listen to Tupac. And so that was fine. If they didn't read Tarkovsky, it was the second time we brought Tarkovsky. If they didn't read that, there were still a lot of ways for them to engage. I've recently had the idea, although we haven't done it yet, of asking everybody if they have a meaningful song they like, and maybe just compiling some lyrics from those meaningful songs and coming in the session with that. That way everybody would have one thing that they could really deeply talk about, and hopefully learn a little bit from everyone else. All right, so we also, probably my favorite of our topics, as you can see by how many readings, existentialism and the meaning of life. And I will say, anybody who was in any philosophy classes with me knows that those were the classes I took. But I don't just pick these out because I like them, although I will be honest, Nietzsche was the one I picked out just because I liked him. We have the most deeply engaging conversations when we talk about this material. Because even if they haven't read the material, they can talk about what they think the meaning of their life is. Frequently when that comes up, people talk about the Gospels. I'll be honest, I actually had to go home one night and think, gosh, I really haven't read this stuff like they have. If that's how they're engaging in the material, those are 4 more books that I should be reading. And so I went home and started reading those just to be able to have deeper conversations about the meaning of life, even though we're not bringing in the Gospels, or at least we haven't yet. I guess we could. So even if people don't engage directly with the philosophers that we bring in, they talk about what we are talking about. Whether it be the Gospels or the Quran or things of that nature. Especially with the meaning of life, one of the texts that we actually read is an Introduction to Philosophy book that talks about all the different meanings of life. And I wish I would have brought it today, I did not, but the entire chapter talks about life as different things. So the first one might be life as a game, or life as a comedy, or unfortunately, one that a lot of people didn't like, and we had one participant argue adamantly against, life as tragedy. Additionally, things like life as a mission, which is where a lot of people dived really deeply into what they thought about the Gospels, or other things of that nature. Even if they didn't read the text, they could tell us what they thought the meaning of life was, or they could find the part of the text that talked about that meaning of life and really deeply engage. I think we read that twice. We did it once in minimum, in which all of our attendees that week actually had never come and attended before. And so they had not read what we were reading, which was fortuitous for us because it's a simple reading insofar as life as a game. What do you all think about life as a game? Or life as tragedy? What do you all think about that? And we really went one by one until the couple of people who showed up started telling us, oh no, let's add to that list. And by the end of our session, we had the full board filled up with meanings of life that were not from the text, which I thought was really amazing, that we aren't always just reading a text trying to figure out what that author meant. We're adding on to the discussion. Absolutely. Of course, phones aren't allowed in Lansing Correctional Facility, so I couldn't take a picture of the whiteboard and show all of you. If I could, I would have, just to show you how deeply engaging that conversation was. But yeah, no cell phones allowed, no photography. So we also talked about Kierkegaard's Sickness Unto Death, which is a notoriously difficult book. The reason we read it is because after reading something else, one of the guys actually said, hey, I wrote something, can I read it? Which always the answer is yes, please. And he read one of the most beautiful expositions of Kierkegaard's first couple of paragraphs of that book that I had ever heard. Now, I know not tons of people in here might have read that book, but for those of you who have, in philosophy class, that's usually the part where the teacher really has to lead that discussion. I remember my mentor, Clancy Martin, who I mentioned earlier. Usually he would lead discussions by asking, hey, what did you think about the text? We'd go around the room and get through a lot of the book that way. When we talked about Sickness Unto Death, it was sort of quiet and crickets, and he walked up to the board and started teaching. So I was really amazed that without any provocation, somebody had written on that topic and explained it just as well, if not maybe a little bit better than our own doctors, our own PhDs at UMKC had. And so we sort of brought it in after that because, well, they're already engaging with it, so let's help them engage further. After that, as you can see, Nietzsche, I chose personal selections. I know anybody who knows me might be thinking, how are we this far into a presentation on philosophy with Kevin and he hasn't brought up Nietzsche? Well, don't worry, I'm bringing him up now. I actually waited to read him in Lansing for a long time because we have one of our most, actually I think he's come every single time and was coming every single time before the pandemic. One of the guys who attends our session, he hates Nietzsche with a passion. In fact, sometimes if I want to quote Nietzsche, I'll just say a philosopher instead of saying Nietzsche to avoid the he was crazy conversation, which we've had a lot. Until one year, I think it was canceled due to weather, but we were going to have a session on my birthday, and I thought I can be a little bit selfish on my birthday, and I will pick out my favorite parts of Nietzsche and we'll talk about them. And I think by the end of that session, I think the Nietzsche hater in our group had maybe come around a little bit. Sometimes now I find him quoting Nietzsche without using the name several times, just like, didn't somebody say? Yeah, somebody said it. We don't have to say who, somebody said it. But the material with Nietzsche is something that spanned a really long time, and he is an author who is very hard to read because he goes from poetry and song to essay to an epic story that spans 4 books and everything in between. And so I tried to pick excerpts from all over, that way we could sort of talk about him as a whole. One of the most deeply engaging parts of his book that we talked about was a passage known as the eternal return, or in other translation, the eternal recurrence. Some of you might be familiar. I thought about reading the passage, but I think I'll just sort of paraphrase for us. This is in Nietzsche's text, The Gay Science. Nietzsche essentially says, imagine yourself one night, and he says a really lonely night. He actually says, in your most lonely of lonelies. Imagine that you are laying in bed and some fairy or demon comes to you and says, this hasn't been the first time. You've lived this life before, and before, and before, and infinitely times so. That this life that you are living right now is not the first time you've done it. You've done it, not just you've done it the exact same way, hundreds or thousands, or you don't know, millions of times. And he doesn't want that to be a myth that we believe in, like, oh gosh, this is something that sounds a little bit more like reincarnation here. But he doesn't think about it that way. He wants to think of that as a test. He says that is a test to give yourself. Does that make you feel elated? Does that raise your spirit? Do you think, okay, cool, I really like my life. I like the character that I'm playing in the play we call life, and I want to keep doing it. And the way I'm doing it is fine. Or does that sort of crush your spirit? Does that make you feel like, oh God, I don't want to be doing this again? And he said, based on that, you can learn a lot about yourself and other people, what your answer to that question was. And we all asked ourselves that question. We had a few yeses, and as always, a whole bunch of no's and no ways. For the people who said no way, some of them clearly related it to their time incarcerated in Lansing, that if they got the choice, they really wouldn't do that all over again, or in general in their life, if they got the chance, they wouldn't do it all over the same again. But we talked about, despite all that hopefully they could still find meaning in what they were doing right now. And I will say, I, in addition to teaching in the Academic Achievement Center, I also teach GED for the college in a different correctional facility, not Lansing. And we actually have at least 2 of our participants in Lansing who are GED tutors, doing the exact same thing I do, but inside the facility. And so despite the fact that they might not want to live their whole life over again, they are still able to find a lot of meaning and engagement in what they do on a daily basis. Other than that, we talked about a lot of other selections from Nietzsche. We also talked about a series of passages called the 4 Questions of Conscience. For anybody incarcerated or anybody in the world, I think the questions of conscience are things that really, hopefully our conscience is, we do ask questions of ourselves with our conscience. And Nietzsche had a few specific ones he wanted us to ask that we really deeply engaged with. Questions like, Essentially, when you are separated from a group, do you separate from the group to lead them or to get away from them? Or maybe to follow them because you're lagging a little bit behind? Or a passage that I think my mentor Clancy Martin, in his own copy of the book, when we were talking about it, he had written the most painful next to this passage. There was a passage in which Nietzsche asked, are you a character or an actor? Or are you just the copy of an actor? And thinking about how much mimicry goes on in life, Clancy thought that was one of the most painful things he had ever read. Not just am I acting, maybe I'm copying another actor. And we just started talking about movies at that point, like how many people based their personalities on a character in a play or a movie or TV show they might have seen, and sort of forgotten about where that came from. This goes back also to things like with Aristotle, we talked about where do we get our personality or our virtue or our characteristics? A lot of times we get them from watching other people and incorporating those aspects into our life. So we talked about that a lot with Nietzsche. I wouldn't be surprised if we bring him back in at some point. I will wait a little bit just so we don't have more conversations like, oh God, I hate this guy. Absolutely. We've read before and we're about to read again, Sartre's Existentialism is a Humanism, which is a really interesting title. Two isms in a book title is a lot to deal with. I will say it's a really short book and it's a free book. You may or may not know that all public lectures given in France are immediately in the public domain. If you give a public speech in France, you aren't making any money off that. Which Sartre's family is still really disappointed in. They constantly, they really like to try and copyright new editions, but you can go find it for free. Absolutely. It's a really short book with the Q&A section. It's only about that big. So we read a huge selection from it. And in that text, we talked a lot about responsibility. So Sartre is asked a question from one of his students during Nazi occupation of France. Sartre was, for a long time, probably the leading public intellectual in France. And that's not a country always like other countries. France, they really pride their public intellectuals. It would be like a football star for them. They're really prideful about that. And so he was asked a question by one of his students. I have a moral dilemma and I need help. And Sartre said, I know you need help, but I really can't answer moral questions for you. Which isn't really what you're looking for when you're asking for advice. You really just want somebody to give you what to do and say, okay, that's exactly what I'm going to do from now on. Sartre understands that that's the easy route to take, but he wants to explain that that is not really the route that we should be taking. And so in Lansing, we discussed when we're met with a moral dilemma, we can ask our teachers, we can ask our priests, we can ask our mentors, but ultimately the question is a question about who we are. And that's not a question that our priests or professors can answer for us. And so that was a question we tried to really deeply engage with in Lansing. Sartre is actually specifically asked the question from a young man, a student who his father and brother have passed away in the war at some point, and he really wants to avenge his family. He wants to avenge France. He wants to fight in the resistance. But his mom doesn't have anyone else. With the father and brother being dead, no one's there to take care of mom. And so he is met with this moral dilemma. Do I fight in the resistance for France, for my family, for everyone, or do I stay home with mom? And Sartre said that really is, and this is a huge moral dilemma. I love my mom. I would like to think if my country was invaded by a Nazi occupation that I would maybe do something about it. I'd like to think so. But at the same time, if I had to choose between something like that and the well-being of my mom, that's a really tough choice. So because of that, Sartre leaves us with the idea that one or the other really doesn't make you a morally better person, just a morally different person. That one of those is a very moral, loving son, and the other one might be a very moral, loving patriot, and that we can't really put those on equal footing, that we can't put those versus each other. And we talked about that a lot in our session, that all of us have a lot of life dilemmas, and in the end, it's how we answer that question that really determines who we are. And that was really deeply engaging material. We also had Borges' selected fictions. Just a span of some fictions. And this is probably one of the last texts we'll talk about tonight. I know I spent a lot of time talking about the philosophy, but it's hard to show you how we engage without showing you the exact material we engage with. So you'll pardon me if I spoke a little bit more about some of the philosophy than you may be expected tonight, but we're in school, so maybe we should have expected that tonight. So with Borges, he has a passage in which there is a leopard in a cage. And the leopard, as you can imagine, doesn't really like being in its cage, much like my border collie at home is probably really anxiously awaiting my return to let her out of her kennel. Unfortunately, the leopard doesn't get let out of its kennel. It stays there, and in the passage, we are essentially faced with the fact that the leopard is sort of worrying, did I miss my meaning? Did I miss what I'm supposed to do? And that is how actually one of the guys engaged with the material. Those were the words of one of the incarcerated individuals, not mine, that the leopard might feel like it has missed the bus, so to speak, as far as the meaning of life goes. And that's something that a lot of people in Lansing and a lot of incarcerated people and a lot of people in general face, that what is the meaning of my life, and did I miss it? That would be a problem, I think. But as we go on, we find out that this leopard, somebody walks by this leopard, a really famous person. Dante walks by this leopard. The famous Dante, who wrote Dante's Inferno. And he was inspired by this leopard to write. And he was inspired to such an extent that I'm sure a lot of people had to read part of Dante's Inferno as part of a college class. Although, as oftentimes is the case, maybe we didn't read the whole thing. But the idea that despite the fact that the leopard didn't feel like it got what it wanted, its life had eternal meaning. From Dante to everybody who read Dante, that leopard was extending the meaning of its life well past what it saw, which I think, especially for the guys who are GED tutors in there, that's a really incredible thing. That they are day in, day out working to try and get people in a better place, not for themselves, they might never see these people again, but just for their sake, that the meaning of their life extends beyond themselves, and it extends beyond those people to everybody that those people touch with their lives. And so I think that is probably one of the last slides on actual philosophy. Now back to the program itself. So I know not everybody in here might be super interested in philosophy. I know everybody in here, even if they are interested, getting involved in a philosophical reading group might not be what they want. That's okay, because the Arts in Prison program has tons of other programs to offer. These are just a few. Lee could tell you a lot about any of the others. I actually at one point remember Lee telling me, if we don't have it, if there's somebody who wants to get it going, we'll get it going. And so these are some of the things that they have done at Lansing in the past. I'm not sure if all of these programs are currently running. I'm sure there are others that I haven't listed that are currently going. So the Arts in Prison program is really, really amazing. We really couldn't do what we do without the rest of this going on. And so yeah, if you were interested in this kind of thing, maybe not philosophy exactly, they have everything from poetry to painting, I think, to even yoga, which I thought was really interesting. That's probably really good for those guys. Additionally, there are a lot of religious organizations. When I teach GED in the Johnson County Corrections Adult Residential Center, what a mouthful, they usually just refer to it as ARC, which does get a little bit confusing because we also have the Academic Resource Center. So both of my jobs actually share a very similar acronym, despite being very far from each other. I will say probably every other time I'm teaching in the classroom hallway at ARC, church groups walk up and down the hallway, usually bringing coffee and donuts, which I don't bring in because the college doesn't afford me a coffee and donuts budget. If they did, I might bring it in. But I do let all of my GED students go run and ask if they can get a cup of coffee. I think it's a little bit rude for people to walk by with boxes and boxes of donuts and not offer any, especially when we are slogging through high school algebra from 5:30 to 8:30 p.m. And so you can imagine by 8:30 p.m. doing algebra is rough. I don't drink the coffee because I think I would probably be teaching way too fast, but I let them all get it to hopefully get some pep in their step as far as doing math goes. And I think if I didn't, I think we'd probably lose some GED people to some church groups. So sometimes it might be a strategic decision as well. Of course, if they told them no, that would be fine. They would have to respect that. So there are a lot of church groups. Actually, I have the Kansas Department of Corrections volunteer application, and on it, it has a list. Where is the list? Last page. Yeah, here we go. So I'm not going to read all of these groups that you can be a part of because, oh my gosh, it's such a list. But they have everything from many different Protestant churches, Catholic churches, House of Yahweh, Islamic groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, Judaic groups, Latter-day Saints, the Moorish Science Temple, Native American religions, Rastafarianism, Spanish Protestant, Thelema, which I think is a little bit like Satanism, Wiccan, etc. Additionally, we have everything from arts and prison is just listed as one thing. I think my most common question with volunteering is, wait, which one are we? It doesn't say if we listed all the arts and prisons things on here. That's a great idea. Whenever I send it out in the email, I have that usually as part of the email, hey, we're part of arts and prison. I remember when I was filling this out, I was like, I don't see philosophy in prison. Am I missing something? No. So there are a lot of other things. Kansas City, Kansas Community College does their GED program out there. Donnelly College does a lot of classes, including a philosophy class, other things including Benedictine College, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, veterans activity groups, the University of St. Mary. There are also some mentoring groups as well. So there are lots and lots and lots of ways to get involved. Additionally, there are always educational programs. I teach GED at ARC, like I was saying earlier, which is essentially a correctional facility in which most people spend about 6 months there. They were facing prison sentences ranging probably from 2 to 10 years, and they had drug-related charges, and the state of Kansas thought, what if we put you in a program that would deal with those drug-related issues and could get you back out into the real world sooner than 10 years? And so a lot of them are in there about 6 months, and I have had a few successful graduates. I've only been doing that since this summer, but I wanted to sort of plug that program through JCCC and Johnson County Adult Education as something else I'm a part of. We have several people currently testing and probably will get their GED very, very soon. Other than that, there's also the College of Trades. They actually bus people from ARC up to the college to do the welding program, the automotive program. Gosh, there are probably a lot of others, but most of my students say, I want welding, I want automotive. And I say, that's great, because those automotive folks are amazing. They've repaired my car a number of times and have done a really great job. And I had to buy the parts, but they saved me probably hundreds in labor. So there's a little plug for the automotive department here as well. In addition to that, I forgot to put them up here. I don't know a lot about them, but there is also currently a group centered in Kansas City, Missouri, and they are called Liberation Lit. I forgot their name for a moment. Liberation Lit, and they send books individually to people inside Lansing. It's very hard to get books in general in, but you can send individual books in. Usually they have to be directly from Amazon or directly from the publisher. No scribbles in them, no possibility for notes, etc., which can be a little bit disappointing if you try to send someone a book and it gets sent back to you. But yeah, straight from the publisher. But there are other groups doing things like that. Other than that, I think that really wraps up what I was going to talk about tonight. I do encourage everybody to try and get involved in some way or other in helping people incarcerated at this time. Thank you for attending my talk. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm Farrell Hoygen. I'm Director of Faculty Development, and we kind of oversee the College Scholar Program, and I think this was such an interesting, engaging, enriching presentation. Thank you so much. I feel very inspired, and I can only imagine what the groups you work with, how they feel. Does anybody have any questions you want to ask tonight? And we do have coffee and not donuts, but cookies. So please help yourself to as many of those as you'd like. Anybody have any questions or anything you would? I have to say, I teach English language learners, and Bruce Lee is the great unifier.
Absolutely.
Like, you cannot go
Absolutely.
wrong if you've
Yeah.
got Bruce Lee in your
Absolutely
class.
right. Really no questions? Any? Yeah.
I just wondered if the people that participate, is it like a privilege? Do they have to earn it, or is it, can anybody?
Can you repeat the question for the video?
Yeah, so is attending things like this, or this program in particular, is it a privilege for the guys in Lansing? I will say yes. For the most part, if they've done something that they shouldn't have done inside of Lansing, we're not going to see them for a little bit, at least a little bit. I will say that all the guys in our sessions are always seem to be, as far as our sessions go, really engaged, really interested, although I'm not sure what they've done before or outside of our sessions, and I do keep that in mind. But yeah, it is a little bit of a privilege, mostly in that if they misbehave inside of Lansing, no activities.
So it's an incentive.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say so. Yeah, absolutely. And a question we often get, actually I remember one of our volunteers actually asked me this at one point before his first day, are they handcuffed? No. Is there a CO in the room, a corrections officer? No. We do have one out in the hallway, immediately through the window, and so there is somebody there if we need them, hopefully. They're there, and no, they're not handcuffed. Most of them are wearing blue jeans or a blue jean jacket. So yeah, absolutely, no handcuffs, no CO in the room, etc. Other questions? Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if I need that or not. Okay, so Kevin really enjoyed this
Thank you.
tremendously. I don't really have I don't think it's a question, it's more of a comment, I guess, because I really don't know that much about philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I could certainly see, after your discussion, how it's such a broad area, such a broad topic, and how it could really generate the kind of discussions, the really deep discussions with the inmates that you're able to do. And I just wonder if there's a way for you guys to measure any kind of change. I don't know if it's behavioral change or any kind of where it's really helped. Do you get feedback from the inmates? You know, that hey, these are really helping me. I mean, that's kind of what I guess I'm wondering about.
Yeah, so we don't have any direct way to measure how our texts have changed people's lives. Much like in an ethics class here, we're not really sure where they go always after our sessions or what they do. But I will say a lot of people have spoken to the fact that specific texts or specific discussions have opened their eyes to other ways of being in a lot of ways. And so I'll have people come up and say, I've never read about that before, but that was amazing. What else can I read on the topic? Of course, we do have some people who've, I probably should have mentioned earlier, especially with Buddhism. One time we had a really deeply engaged discussion, and one of the incarcerated individuals told us he had been studying Buddhism for 7 years. I thought, well, you're pretty much a PhD in Buddhism, and I am not. I didn't have a ton of Eastern philosophy in school. And so with that, sometimes people come to us loving philosophy, sometimes people find a love of philosophy kind of through us. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions, comments?
I think we can continue the conversation informally with some snacks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Inspiring and educational.